Okay, well, it's 2 minutes to midday, so good morning, ladies and gentlemen, in person and virtually. Right, yeah, I've got a 10-minute slot, so I need to be quite rapid. The panel discussion, which is going to follow this talk, is discussing net zero mining and decarbonisation, and so around that word transition and or transitional risk, if you're in a disclosure environment, and this aspect of climate change is receiving a lot of attention. But equally importantly, in a climate change strategy is adaptation. So adaptation is my key word, and how an organisation develops and implements a climate change adaptation plan, and also manages the disclosure pressures as well. So transitional risk on the one side, and adaptation, or in TCFD language, physical risk on the other. So I'm going to be concentrating on the latter, on physical risk. Yeah, and I'll be focusing on a little bit focused on the mining sector. So we just go to the next. I think if you just run through. Yeah, that's fine. Whoop, go back. Sorry, this is the problem with. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, just a little agenda. I'll just introduce what climate change adaptation is briefly. I'll talk about climate change adaptation specifically in the mining industry, and I'll present a few examples and some work involved with. The approach to assessment of adaptation management, adaptation strategies. I'll touch briefly on financial disclosure, particularly TCFD aspects, just to sort of get that context in place. Brief summary. Okay, next slide, thanks. Yeah, perhaps just click through 1, 2, 3. That's one more. Fine. Okay, that's probably easiest that way. Yeah, what is climate change adaptation? Well, I put up a not strictly definitions, but according to the IPCC, adaptation is the process of adjustment of actual unexpected climate and its effects in order to moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. And the ICMM, similarly, climate change adaptation seeks to lower the risks and exploit opportunities. In summary, adaptation is about identifying risks around climate change and developing solutions to provide resilience. It's about building resilience into your assets, into your organisation. Climate change is called, well, we're all familiar with sort of the key headlines here, but shifts in climate patterns, extreme weather events, and increased climate variability, and hence uncertainty. And uncertainty is an important aspect of this, and we'll come on to that later on. So it's leading to effects such as damage to fixed assets, disruption of supply chains. Supply chains being, as we were talking about this morning, a very important part of the mining industry, mining process. Just running down the list there briefly, some of the wider impacts as well are the environmental sort of ecosystem impacts and the social, the impacts of vulnerable communities as well. So adaptation solutions is about incorporating resilience into your business and managing the risks around that. So next slide, please. Thanks. Yeah. So this slide it's a graphic from the ICMM's adapting to a change in climate document, which visualises this nicely. And so we design and operate mines based on the historic climbing record, which is more or less a stationary baseline. Can you just go one more, please? And one more again. So going forward, we have to accommodate climate change. In this case, with the metric we're looking at, we have an upward shifting pattern on our graph. So we need to implement adaptation solutions in the next just click again. Okay, we have to implement adaptation solutions to build that resilience into the operations, not just into the operational phase, but also well beyond into closure as well. And that long time frame, which we're often dealing with, is a very important aspect of this. So next slide. Thank you. So yeah, some key areas of concern to mining companies. Well, it's probably top of the list for most people is water management. Broadly speaking, it's either too much or too little, but yeah, dealing with too much water, excess water, storm events, and managing that water, but equally drought and water scarcity, and then flood risk as well. Other areas, changes in geotechnical conditions, so stability issues, integrity of structures, the performance of facilities with long lifespans, and the impacts in closure. I'm going to be mentioning closure quite a few times in the talk. It's a very important element in adaptation. But equally, it's not just about physical assets. It's about people and issues such as heat and heat injury. Working conditions with workforce, and supply chain impacts there as well. So next, traditionally, we incorporate climate elements into our mine in terms of designing the mine and operating the mine. Climate change and extreme climate events acts as a modifier to those aspects, and it's this modifier which has to be managed in future risks. So next slide, thanks. Oh, sorry, go back. Yep. Example adaptations to building resilience into mining projects. So again, we're back to water, introducing greater capacity in water storage facilities and features, greater capacity to move water. So, for example, dewatering systems, that sort of thing, being able to cope better with these shifting events. Improved monitoring and early warning systems is very, very important aspect. We're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, so measuring, monitoring is a very important message. Optimizing the water circuit, and also looking at the wider ESG aspects of multi-stakeholder approach. Okay, next slide, thanks. Just very briefly running through tailings facilities, because they are a very important area of concern when we're looking at adaptation, and the two key areas: failure risk and long-term considerations. Climate change is incorporated quite heavily into the GISTM, the global standard on tailings management, which in itself is supported by a very recent document, the ICMM's Tailings Management Practice Guide. So just a few examples here of adaptation and building resilience into TSFs. The whole post-closure considerations is a huge area, and it's things like having a forward-thinking water balance, which is looking at future scenarios of climate change, and practical things, increased decant facilities, etc. Let's move on to the next slide, please. And we're at time. And just another sort of specific example in terms of this time from a climate point of view, looking at permafrost. Permafrost is changes to permafrost is happening now, and there's just one sort of a photographic example there. In SRK, particularly for colleagues in northern Canada, are quite heavily involved in looking for solutions to this. And broadly speaking, on the one side, they're looking at controlled pre-thaw, so actually forcing a thaw to stabilise conditions prior to construction. And then on the opposite side, maintaining permafrost frozen conditions using techniques such as thermocyclons and these materials called phase change materials, which you can incorporate into fill, etc., to help stabilize buildings. Okay, just one more picture, and then we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah. So, addressing climate change adaptation. So I've talked about some of the solutions and practical examples very briefly. I'm now going to sort of go backwards and talk about the process very quickly. Just introduce that. And broadly speaking, it is very site specific. There's unique aspects of every site. A lot of technical assessment involved, but it's that assessment is undertaken within a management sort of leadership context within the organisation. It's very multidisciplinary. It's also an iterative process. We're looking at a lot of uncertainty, long time frames, and the management process to manage adaptation. It will involve continual sort of iteration and continual reprioritization as well, all adaptation priorities. And we're not just dealing with the mine site itself and the infrastructure of the mine site. We have off-site, so if you like, sort of non-controlled infrastructure, which the mine is dependent on, particularly access, and then the wider supply chain. And the next two, please. So yeah, and I've mentioned uncertainty before. Uncertainty is a very important element here. We are making projections, we're undertaking scenarios, projecting a long way into the future. There's considerable uncertainty. The sorts of timeframes that we're looking at typically in our modelling is the near term, so the midpoint being 2020s, mid-century, the midpoint 2050s, and then further out the end of century scenario, which is 2080s. So the next slide, thanks. Yeah, just pop them all up. Two more. Perfect. Oh, too many. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to go into climate change models at all, but what we're using is the IPCC assessment reports, the so-called ARs, and our models. We're now at AR6, which is a middle left figure. We're just starting to transition from AR5 to AR6. So over the last 30 years or so, these models have become increasingly more sophisticated in their approach. But this uncertainty runs through. And just taking one example on the bottom left there, just looking at one factor. So one climate pathway. And looking at one type of storm event, or 1 in 100-year storm event, we look at a median value there, and we calculate that. But we also, there's a huge range of uncertainty around that value. So all that has to be incorporated into the assessment. And the infographic on the right there is a typical sort of summary sort of output that we produce to talk through with clients. And we're looking at three main sort of factors. We're looking at mean annual precipitation, mean annual temperature, and essentially storm events, and looking at those over time frames that we talked about. And that helps us then to look at adaptation strategies around those changes, those shifts in baseline. Next slide, thanks. Right. So the process that we've talked about, understanding the climate trends, alongside looking at the vulnerability of your operations, so the vulnerability of your assets, of your organisation generally. That's the climate risk assessment, and that's in this model. This is from the Mining Association of Canada. Guide to Climate Change Adaptation to the Mining Industry, so specific to the mining industry, came out earlier this year. They go through a three-stage process, and after the risk assessment, it's developing adaptation measures and then the implementation. Okay, next slide, please. So yeah, I've talked about a number of these documents, but on the left shows you the Mining Association Canada document there. I put a reference list at the back of the presentation. Then the ICMM document in the middle, and then some recently published ISO standards, which are generic standards for addressing adaptation and climate change. So MAC 2021, ICMM 2019, and the ISO standards 2021 again. It's all very, very new, very recent guidance. There's an awful lot coming out at the moment. At the next slide, please. Yeah, we've already had a brief introduction to TCFD, and adaptation is a very important part of disclosure alongside transition risk. As I mentioned, adaptation is they use the term physical risk in TCFD. And the next slide, really the disclosures, the recommendations addressing adaptation and addressing resilience. I've put a very brief summary there, but essentially it's following the same approach that I've talked through. Strong emphasis on metrics and targeting. So again, it's back to this measuring and monitoring imperative. So the final slide is just a very quick summary. So yeah, adaptation is about building in resilience into your assets, into your organisation. The mining operations present somewhat unique challenges in terms of the locations, the types of facilities, tailings facilities, for example, in terms of supply chains, in terms of the long time frames that we're looking for an operation through to closure. So dealing with uncertainty is challenging, but there are there is a robust approach that you can take using climate modelling combined with technical expertise. Adaptive management and adaptive priorities is going to be key in managing adaptation for organisations. Again, fundamentally, this has to be embedded into an organisation's governance and leadership. It's got to be driven from the top. It's got to be part of the changing culture of the organisation. And as I said, it's an important part of climate-related financial disclosure. So thank you very much.